There is a word for ground that holds water when it should not. There is a word for soil that is not soil, but a suspension of mud and root and 10,000 years of decomposing leaf ground that will take your boot to the ankle and your fence post to the knee and your hope down to whatever depth hope travels before it runs out of air. The word is swamp, and the word matters because the people who use it are never describing a place they intend to keep. They are describing a place they are finished with, a place they are handing to someone else so they no longer have to think about it. The word swamp is not geography. It is disposal. It is the sound a man makes when he is giving you something he wants to stop owning and calling it a gift and watching your face to see if you understand the difference. Harlan Aldrin understood the difference. He had understood it his entire life, which was why he was so practiced at obscuring it. He was 53 years old in the spring of 1884, a man of the kind that Middle Tennessee produced in some abundance in those decades after the war, large frame, deliberate in speech, possessed of a confidence that came not from wisdom, but from the uninterrupted experience of being agreed with. He owned 240 acres of upland farm in Maury County, a house with 6 rooms and a front porch that faced east, 6 horses, 40 head of cattle, and a church pew in the third row left that had held an Aldrin backside for as long as the church had been standing. He was not a cruel man in the way that men who enjoy cruelty are cruel. He was the other kind, the kind whose cruelty is entirely procedural, the kind who causes harm through the machinery of propriety, who wounds people with documents and departures, and the politely worded expectation that everyone will pretend the wound is something else. His wife Ida was 50, a woman of angular construction physically and otherwise. She had strong opinions about the proper order of things, and the proper order of things included the belief that a woman who had not borne a child in 3 years of marriage had failed at the central obligation of her existence. Not failed medically, failed morally. This was the distinction that mattered to Ida. The body's difficulty was not the point. The body's difficulty was in Ida's accounting simply the visible evidence of a character deficiency she had suspected from the beginning. She had not approved of Mira Voss when Corbett brought her home in the spring of 1881. She did not approve of her in the spring of 1884, either, though by then the disapproval had been refined by 3 years of close observation into something more precise, something clinical. The disapproval of a woman who has gathered her evidence patiently and is now prepared to present her findings. Corbett Aldrin was 26, the only son, and he had his father's frame and his mother's eyes and neither parent's will. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had been managed from birth and had mistaken the management for love, and had therefore arrived at adulthood without the equipment to recognize the difference or to resist the one in favor of the other. He had married Mira Voss because he wanted to, which was the only genuinely independent act he had committed in his adult life, and he had not been able to sustain the independence past the first winter. Mira had known this about him within the first 6 months. She had understood it the way she understood most things, not in an instant of dramatic revelation, but through the patient accumulation of small evidence, the way Corbett's eyes moved to his father when Harlan entered a room, the way he answered his mother's questions, with the care of a man who had learned early that certain answers were safer than others, the way he sometimes started to say something and stopped, not because the thought was unfinished, but because he had calculated its reception and found the odds unfavorable. She did not stop loving him for it. She simply added it to her understanding of her situation, the way you add a fact to a map. Here is what this terrain actually looks like. Here is where the soft ground is. Here is where the footing is firm. The footing in the Aldrin household was almost nowhere firm. Mira had grown up in a different kind of house. Her father, a man named Voss, who had farmed a small piece of bottom ground near Columbia and died when Mira was 14, had been the kind of man who treated competence as the highest form of respect. He had taught Mira to read not just the Bible, but everything that came through the house almanacs and newspapers and the occasional volume that arrived from somewhere by mail. He had taught her to observe before concluding, to question the explanation that arrived ready-made, because ready-made explanations were usually made for someone else's convenience. He had taught her that hands which could do useful things were worth more than hands which could not, regardless of what anyone said about the respective dignities of different kinds of work. She had brought all of that into the Aldrin house and found that it was exactly the wrong preparation for the life she was expected to lead there. In the Aldrin house, the highest form of respect was deference. And the highest form of deference was the smooth performance of agreement, the seamless presentation of a woman who had no thoughts that had not already been approved by the room. Mara could not perform this. She had tried in the first months with the effort of someone learning a new language, drilling the vocabulary, practicing the grammar, trying to produce in herself the reflex of yielding that came naturally to women who had been raised to it. She was not successful. Not because she was defiant, she was not particularly defiant by nature, but because deference requires you to actually stop having thoughts, and Mira could not stop having thoughts any more than she could stop breathing. She kept them behind her eyes. This was the accommodation she arrived at. She kept them behind the dark, careful eyes that people sometimes described as sad, and that were not sad. They were the eyes of someone conducting a continuous and private assessment of everything around her. Someone who had learned early that the assessment was the first and most essential tool, and that the display of the assessment was a separate and entirely optional decision. Harlan did not like her eyes. He had told Corbett this once early in the marriage, in a private conversation that Mira was not supposed to know had occurred, and that she knew had occurred because she was paying attention. A woman shouldn't look at you like she's figuring something out, Harlan had said. It's not comfortable. What Harlan meant was that a woman's eyes, in his experience, should look in directions other than directly at him. They should look downward or toward work or toward children. They should not look at him with the quiet attention of someone who was measuring the gap between what he said and what he meant. Mira's eyes did this. She could not stop them. The 3 years passed the way years pass in a household where the surface is maintained and the truth lives in the spaces between. Bread was made, candles were dipped, soap was rendered from ash, and fat, preserves were put up in rows of glass jars in the cellar. The garden was tended, the house was kept, the meals appeared on the table with the regularity that Ida considered the basic evidence of domestic virtue. Mira did all of these things. She did them well better than Ida. In most respects, though, this was not a fact that anyone in the household was required to acknowledge, and no one did. What Mira did not do was produce a child. 3 years. No pregnancy that held past the early weeks. 2 that started and failed before anyone outside the house could know about them. Losses she had grieved in the particular solitude of a woman who grieves at night in the dark, with her face turned toward the window, because grief that is visible in the Aldrin house becomes evidence of weakness, and weakness in the Aldrin house becomes leverage. By the 3rd spring, Ida had arrived at her verdict. The verdict was delivered through the medium of silence, which was Ida's preferred instrument for communicating conclusions. She wanted to be felt rather than discussed. Meals eaten in the silence of a table where something is not being said. Mornings where Ida moved through the kitchen with the deliberate, unseeing quality of a woman who has reclassified a presence in her house as a problem to be resolved rather than a person to be addressed. Corbett did not intervene. He was not unaware of what was happening. He was aware in the way that a man is aware of weather. He has decided not to dress for consciously choosing the pretense that if he does not acknowledge it, the cold will not reach him. He had been built for compliance, and compliance was what he produced, and Mira had known this for 2.5 years and had stopped waiting for him to produce something else. It was in the second winter that Mira found the book. She found it on a Saturday afternoon in January when Ida had gone to the church for a women's society meeting, and Harlan was in the barn with the horses, and Corbett was in town, and the house was hers for 2 hours in the way that a prisoner's cell is theirs for the hour the guards change. She was in Harlan's library, a room she was technically permitted to enter for cleaning purposes, and that she had been entering for reading purposes for the better part of a year, moving along the shelves with the quiet efficiency of a woman who knows her time is limited. The book was on the lower shelf behind a volume of county land surveys that no one had touched in years. It was a thin thing, perhaps 80 pages, its cover worn at the corners, its spine cracked in a way that suggested it had been opened once or twice and then placed here and forgotten. The title was in 2 languages, English and something else. The English words reading Methods of Cultivation in the Flooded Districts, Raised Bed Techniques for Standing Water Ground. Mira took it from the shelf. She sat in the chair by the window where the light was good, and she opened it and began to read. What she found inside was not what she expected. She had expected theory, the academic exercise of a person who had observed someone else doing something and written it down in the abstract. What she found instead was instruction. Precise, practical, specific instruction. the kind that came from someone who had grown things in standing water for a long time and had worked out through the education of failure and adjustment, and trying again what actually produced a result. The raised beds were the center of it, frames of lumber or split log filled with a mixture of submerged soil and surface clay, built 18 inches above the waterline, elevated planting surfaces surrounded on all sides by standing water. The plants in these beds, the book explained, had access to constant moisture through capillary action from the saturated ground below, while their roots were not submerged and their foliage was not subject to the crawling insects and ground-level pests that destroyed conventional gardens. The standing water was not an enemy, it was infrastructure. It was the pest control and the irrigation system and the boundary marker all at once, and it required nothing from the farmer once built except the planting and the harvest. The book described tomatoes grown in such beds that were remarkable in their size and density, the minerals of the flooded soil concentrating in the fruit in ways that upland growing could not produce. It described squash and beans and sweet potatoes and the vigor of crops grown in soil that had been accumulating organic matter for centuries. The deep black loam of bottomland that was not poor ground, but the richest ground in a landscape requiring only the engineering problem of the water to be solved before it would produce at a rate that made upland farming look timid by comparison. Mira read the entire book. She read it with the attention she gave to things she intended to remember permanently, not just understanding the words, but building the system in her mind, the spatial relationships of the beds and the water, and the movement of nutrients and the logic of elevation. She read it the way her father had taught her to read things that mattered slowly, questioning each claim, asking herself what would fail in this if the conditions were different. What had the author not accounted for? Where was the assumption hidden in the confidence? The answers she arrived at satisfied her. The principles were sound. The engineering was simple enough that it could be accomplished without materials that were difficult to acquire or skills that required years of specialized training. It required primarily the willingness to think about flooded ground differently from the way everyone around her thought about it. She put the book back exactly where she had found it. Behind the land survey's cover facing inward at the precise configuration of something placed there to not be found. She went back to the kitchen and began preparing the evening meal, and she did not mention the book to anyone, and the information in it settled into the deep storage of her memory where she kept the things she was not yet ready to use. 3 weeks later, Harlan set the deed on the table. It was a Tuesday morning in March of 1884. Mara had made breakfast and cleared the dishes and was at the kitchen counter working on the week's bread when Harlan came in from the back hall with the deliberate step of a man who had been carrying something and was ready to set it down. He placed a folded document on the kitchen table and beside it a single sheet of paper covered in Ida's precise forward-leaning script. Ida was in the kitchen. Corbett was not. Harlan explained the situation in the practiced tone of a man who had rehearsed a speech so many times it had lost its texture, become smooth and impersonal, a delivery rather than a conversation. The Aldrin family, he said, had given careful consideration to the circumstances. They wished Mira well. They had no desire to leave her without means. They had in fact arranged to deed to her a property on Cane Creek, 12 acres in the bottomland, south of the home farm free and clear. The deed recorded at the county courthouse, a genuine and unconditional gift to a woman who deserved to have something of her own as she began her new life. He said the words free and clear with a small, unconscious emphasis, the emphasis of a man who has done something he wants credit for and wants the credit established early. The document was the deed. The handwritten sheet was the letter from Ida explaining the terms of Mira's departure. Mira wiped her hands on her apron. She picked up the deed and she read it, not quickly, not the glancing read of a person confirming what they have been told. She read it the way she read everything that had legal weight from the first word to the last in order, with the attention that her father had taught her was the only honest way to receive a document. Harlan waited. The waiting was slightly uncomfortable for him. She could see this in the way he shifted his weight in the small movement of his jaw that meant he had expected something other than this silence, this reading, this unhurried movement of her eyes down the page and back to the top again. Ida stood at the other end of the kitchen with the stillness of a woman who had decided how this scene would proceed and was prepared to wait out any deviation. The deed was for 12 acres. The description of the property matched what Harlan had said: bottomland on Cane Creek south of the home farm, in the low ground where the creek spread into the depression that the local people called the Cane Creek Swamp. The deed was real. The acreage was accurate. The county recording number was present. The language was standard for the period and the place. And in the third paragraph, in the measured legal language that most people skim past without engaging, was a clause that read, subject to prior water rights claims along Cane Creek as recorded in the Maury County Deed Index. Mira read this sentence twice. She read it the way you read a sentence that may be nothing and may be everything, the way you read a sentence in a document written by people who are not your friends, looking for the gap between what it says and what it might mean in the hands of someone who wanted to use it. She could not immediately determine whether it was significant. Prior water rights along Cane Creek. The clause might be standard language, the routine notation of a surveyor covering a common situation in bottomland deeds. It might be meaningless. It might not be meaningless. She folded the deed. Thank you, she said. Ida recited 2 paragraphs about the church and the community and the narrative of Harlan's generosity that was being prepared for public consumption. Mira listened without expression. She was not performing blankness. She was genuinely occupied, the part of her mind that managed the conversation running on its lowest setting, while the deeper machinery worked on the question of the third paragraph. She packed her belongings that afternoon. The things she owned were not many and not large. 2 changes of clothing. Her father's almanac from 1877, dog-eared to uselessness, but still possessed of information she had memorized and could not bring herself to leave behind. A small knife with a bone handle. $3.50 in coin, the earnings of small transactions she had conducted over 3 years of making things butter candles, preserves, and selling them at the general store when Ida was not watching, not in defiance of any rule, but in the understanding that a woman who has no money of her own has a different class of choices than a woman who has some. A cook stove, 2 blankets, tools, an axe, a draw, knife, a handsaw, a hammer, a bag of nails, seeds, tomato, beans, squash, pepper, sweet potato, corn. The cook stove and the tools went onto the small cart she had arranged to borrow from a neighbor, a transaction she had completed 2 days before the morning of the deed, not because she had known the deed was coming. She had not known it precisely, only anticipated it with the general accuracy of a person paying attention to the direction something is moving, but because preparation and anticipation were the same activity, and she had been performing it her entire life. Corbett was in the yard when she loaded the cart. He stood and watched. She did not look at him directly, but she was aware of him in the peripheral and total way she was aware of most things in her surroundings, the same awareness that told her the weather before the weather arrived, that told her the mood of a room before she entered it. He was in pain. She could see this without looking at him. He was in the specific pain of a man who is watching something happen that he has chosen not to stop and who has not yet begun the reinterpretation of his choice that will eventually make it tolerable to live with. She finished loading the cart. She walked past him to check the harness on the mule. "I'm sorry," Corbett said. She adjusted the harness strap. "I know," she said. She did not say more than this because there was no point. The apology was real and it was also useless, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and she did not have the energy to pretend otherwise. She climbed onto the cart seat and clicked her tongue at the mule, and the mule moved, and the cart moved, and Mira Aldrin, born Voss, 22 years old, drove south on the road toward Cane Creek without looking back at the house or the yard or the man standing in it. That night she camped beside the road 2 miles from the Aldrin farm and 4 miles from Cane Creek, because the March evening had closed faster than she expected, and the muss needed water, and she needed to think. She built a small fire from dry branches she collected by feel in the dark at the edge of the tree line. She made coffee in the tin pot she had packed, sitting on the cart seat with her blanket around her shoulders, and in the firelight she took out the deed and read it again. The third paragraph. Subject to prior water rights claims along Cane Creek as recorded in the Maury County Deed Index. She could not know what it meant without going to the Maury County Courthouse. She would go to Columbia on the first market day Thursday the week after she arrived. For she committed to a plan that depended on water she might not yet be certain was hers to depend on. She needed to know what was in that index. She filed this and let it rest. She drank her coffee and watched the fire and thought about the bottomland book in Harlan's library, the one he had purchased, and never read the one that had sat behind the land surveys accumulating dust, while its information waited for someone to find it and take it seriously. She thought about the raised beds described in it, the frames of wood and soil, elevated above standing water, the engineering solution to the problem that everyone in the county had decided had no solution. She slept a few hours and woke before dawn. She arrived at the property at mid-morning. Cane Creek came from the north, running along the eastern side of a shallow depression in the Tennessee bottomland, a bowl in the landscape that the creek had been slowly filling for longer than anyone could measure. The creek spread as it reached the depression, slowing losing its channel, definition, spilling into the flat ground and becoming something that was not quite creek and not quite lake and not quite solid ground, but something between all three, standing water, perhaps 18 inches deep at its center, shallower near the edges, the surface covered in a mat of duckweed so dense and so uniformly green that from a distance it looked like a field. Bald cypress stood in the water in scattered clusters, their trunks swelling at the base the way cypress trunks do the knees of their root systems, rising from the water around them, like the stumps of a forest that had drowned and left only its knuckles showing. Tupelo trees stood between the cypress, their roots in the water, their canopies meeting overhead in places to create the filtered light of a space that is simultaneously forest and water, neither completely one nor completely the other. The 12 acres were bounded on the east by a low ridge of dry ground, a band of higher elevation, perhaps 30 to 50 feet wide, and running north to south along the eastern edge of the property, rising 3 to 5 feet above the waterline. This ridge was different ground entirely from the swamp dry clay soil, hardwood forest, the massive trunks of tulip poplar trees rising straight and clean, the kind of timber that was worth money, the kind a sawmill operator would cross the county to buy. Mira drove the cart to the base of the ridge and tied the mule to a tree and climbed to the top. She stood on the ridge and looked west. 8 acres of stand-in walnut and cypress and tupelo and the green mat of duckweed spread before her, the morning light coming across it from the east at an angle that made the water visible beneath the duckweed in flashes, where the mat was thin. Dark water, still water, the surface broken here and there by the curved back of a turtle, moving slowly from one cypress knee to another. A great blue heron stood in the shallows to the northwest with the absolute patience of a bird that had been standing in shallow water since before there was such a thing as patience, waiting for a fish to make the mistake that fish eventually made. Everything was quiet except for the red-winged blackbirds calling from the reeds at the northern edge of the property and the far rattling cry of a kingfisher, somewhere in the cypress, and the sound of the water, which was not the sound of standing water, but the sound of moving water, slow and barely perceptible, the sound of 8 acres of swamp processing the world at its own pace. Mira stood on the ridge and she did not see waste. She saw protein, catfish and bluegill in the channels between the cypress roots, creatures that had been feeding themselves in this water since before anyone alive could remember, requiring no corn, no hay, no fencing, no winter care, no work beyond the catching. She had seen fish traps in her father's almanac, the V-shaped weirs of woven cane that native hunters had used for centuries in exactly this kind of water funnel-shaped channels that guided fish into an enclosure from which they could not find the exit. She saw soil, not the thin, rain-depleted red clay of the upland farms that produced well in good years and failed in dry ones, but the deep black accumulation of the bottomland, the organic matter of 1,000 years of flooding, the sediment of 1,000 springs deposited in layers, each layer a year's worth of the creek's generosity compressed by time and weight into something almost too rich to use at once. Swamp soil when drained is the richest soil in Tennessee, her father had told her once. But you don't drain it to use it, she had thought even then. You build above it. She saw the raised beds from the book. She saw them clearly in her mind. The frames of split log rising 18 inches above the waterline, the black swamp muck packed into them, the tomatoes and squash and beans growing in a soil so concentrated with mineral wealth that they would produce at a rate that the upland farmers would not believe and would not be willing to credit once they saw it, because what the upland farmers believed about swamp ground was what Harlan believed about that book on his shelf, that it had nothing useful to offer, that the thing you could not understand was automatically the thing that had nothing to teach you. She saw timber. The tulip poplars on the ridge behind her, 6 trees each over 100 feet tall and 3 feet through the trunk, each one worth $8 as standing timber. $48 in trees alone, more than many families in the county saw in a year. She would not sell them all. She would keep most of them the way a person kept most of their savings. But 2 she could part with if she needed to. 4 she would grow. She saw 4 acres of dry ridge for a cabin and a garden and a smokehouse and whatever else time and work produced. And she saw the quiet, no one within sight, no one within earshot, no one to require her to perform the smooth and effortless deference that the Aldrin household had demanded of her for 3 years. No one to assess her eyes and find them unsettling. No one to remind her that her body had failed an obligation. Just the swamp and the ridge and the poplars and the herons and the slow green water and whatever she chose to make of it. She climbed down from the ridge and she unloaded the cart. She felled the first tree that afternoon. An oak from the ridge, not one of the poplars she would need for lumber, but not for a cabin's walls. And the oak was the right size and the right straightness for what she was building. She notched it with an axe she had brought, reading the grain the way her father had shown her, understanding which direction the tree wanted to fall, and positioning herself accordingly, not fighting the wood, but working with the physics of it. The tree came down. She spent the next 3 days felling and limbing and notching. She had no second pair of hands, and she had no intention of waiting for a second pair of hands. She had watched men build alone when they had to, had understood the principle, if not the specific techniques, and the specific techniques were available to anyone who thought carefully about leverage and improvised accordingly. A pole and a rope and a fulcrum could accomplish what a second person accomplished more slowly, but with equal result. She built the system as she went, refining it each time, learning from each log the small adjustments that made the next one easier. Before the first week was out, she drove to Columbia on Thursday market day. The courthouse was a brick building on the square, 2 stories with a cupola designed to look important, and had succeeded. She tied the mule at the post on the east side of the square and went inside and asked the clerk at the front desk to see the Maury County deed index for property along Cane Creek. The clerk was a young man in a collar slightly too tight, and he looked at her with the mild surprise of a man not accustomed to women arriving at the courthouse alone and requesting specific documents. He retrieved the index without comment. Mira sat at the table provided and opened the volume. The deed index for Cane Creek properties covered 4 pages of fine print, the accumulated record of transfers and claims and easements along the creek going back to the earliest years of the county's legal organization. She read through the entries for the bottomland on the south end of the creek with the careful attention of someone looking for a name or a term that would indicate the specific claim the deed had referenced. She found it on the 3rd page. The prior water rights claim on Cane Creek in the bottomland section had been recorded in 1871 by a farmer named Witt. The claim was for irrigation rights, specifically for the diversion of creek water into a field channel on the upstream property for the purpose of watering a hay meadow on the western slope of the Witt land. Irrigation rights. Upstream. A field channel diverting water from the creek before it reached the bottomland. Mira read the entry twice. The language was clear. The Witt claim was to the water in the creek channel above the bottomland. It was specifically an upstream irrigation right to take water out of the creek before it flowed downstream to divert it into a field channel for agricultural purposes on the Witt property. It said nothing about the standing water in the bottomland below. It could not say anything about the standing water in the bottomland below because the standing water in the bottomland below was not creek water being diverted. It was water that had spread naturally from the creek into the depression of the bottomland by the action of gravity filling the swamp the way it had been filling it for 10,000 years, long before anyone had thought to record a rights claim for anything. She closed the index. She thanked the clerk. She drove back to Cane Creek. She noted the entry in her memory Witt upstream irrigation field channel on western slope. The claim pertained to the creek channel above, not to her swamp below. This was what she had needed to know, and she knew it now, and the knowing freed her to commit fully to what she had seen from the ridgeline on the first morning. She went back to work. The cabin went up in the course of April and May. It was 12 feet by 14 feet, which was small enough to heat easily and large enough for what she needed, which was a space to cook and sleep and store things and think without anyone watching. The logs she had cut fitted into each other at the corners with the notching her father had shown her, the joints chinked with clay from the ridge slope, a mixture of clay and dried moss and finely chopped straw that she packed into every gap with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the difference between a warm cabin and a cold one was the sum of 100 small gaps she had either sealed or left open. The hearth was field stone gathered from the ridge stones she carried one by one in a wooden yoke across her shoulders, making as many trips as the work required, building the firebox and the chimney in the patient way that the hearth required, each stone placed to distribute weight correctly. Each course of the chimney slightly narrower than the one below it, the draw improved by a small clay cap that she shaped to deflect the wind away from the opening. The floor was packed earth hardened with a wash of clay, slip that she applied and let dry and applied again until the surface was smooth and dark and solid underfoot. The door she hung on wooden hinges she carved from the dense heartwood of a hackberry stump she had found at the northern end of the ridge. The hinges were not elegant. They worked. That was the standard she applied. She hung the door facing west. West was the swamp. West was the water and the cypress and the heron and the slow procession of the afternoon sun across the sky above the water, which produced on the evenings when the clouds cooperated a display of color across the western horizon that she had no previous reference point for. She had seen sunsets before. She had never seen a sunset reflected in still water. The swamp doubled everything. It took the orange and the deep rose and the purple gray of the cloud edges, and it laid them flat across the surface of the water and gave them back the sky and the reflections so precisely matched at the tree line that the two of them together made a complete thing, a sphere of color above and below the dark line of the cypress, a room with a floor of water and a ceiling of sky, and the evening pouring through it from the west. She sat on the porch she had built 4 posts and a flat roof of split boards running the full width of the cabin's west face, and she looked at it on the evening of the day she finished the door. The cabin was not finished. There was no loft, no root cellar, no smokehouse, no furniture beyond the cot she had built from split hickory and rope. There was a cook stove connected to the chimney by a length of salvaged stovepipe. There was a stack of split wood on the porch. There was a shelf on the wall holding her seeds and her $3.50 and her father's almanac. There was the evening light over the swamp. She had understood for most of her life that beauty was a thing a person earned. Not a reward for virtue, not the gift of a benevolent creator, but the product of attention, the capacity to notice what was present when you had been trained by circumstance to look for what was wrong. She had spent 3 years in a house where the act of noticing things was itself a kind of transgression, where the attentive eyes were the unsettling eyes, where paying attention was interpreted as judgment, and judgment was an act of war. Here there was no one to interpret her eyes. She watched the color move across the water until the light was gone and the swamp went to its evening sounds, the frogs beginning their catalog in the shallows, the night herons taking their stations in the cypress, the slow plunk of a catfish somewhere in the dark water that she could hear but not see. She went inside and built a small fire in the cook stove and made her dinner from the supplies she had brought on the cart. She sat at the edge of the cot with the lamp burning. She thought about what she had seen from the ridge line on her first morning. She thought about the courthouse and the Witt irrigation claim and what it did and did not cover. She thought about the raised beds from the book, the frames of wood and soil elevated above standing water. And she thought about the muck she had seen from the ridge, the black bottom material that had been building under the Cane Creek swamp since before anyone in this county was born. She had arrived at this place by the route of being given something that was intended as a disposal. This was not lost on her. She thought about Harlan at the table with his deed and his practiced speech, the free and clear delivered with the emphasis of a man expecting gratitude. She thought about what it must have looked like from where he stood, the orderly removal of an inconvenience, the generous resolution of a difficult situation, the provision of a worthless piece of ground to a woman who had no grounds on which to expect anything at all. She thought about the book on his shelf that he had bought and not read. She thought about the raised beds. She thought about the 12 acres in the bottomland along Cane Creek, the 12 acres that Harlan Aldrin had given away because swamp was the word for something worthless. And that was sitting in the dark now, with its fish and its crayfish and its centuries of deposited soil and its tulip poplars in its evening light that made the whole sky into a room. She thought about all of it, and then she stopped thinking about it, and she went to sleep, and she woke up in the morning, and she went to work. That first raised bed went in on a Thursday afternoon in late April of 1884, 3 days after her return from the Columbia courthouse. The materials were straightforward. She had split oak from the cabin building lengths of log, cut to 12 feet, and split into slabs that were roughly 3 inches thick. She needed a frame, and the frame was simple 4 sides of split log, 12 feet by 3 feet in dimension. The corners spiked together with the heavy nails she had brought in her supply bag. She built the frame on the dry ground of the ridge, first checking the corners for square with a length of string measured diagonally, which was the method her father had shown her for ensuring that a rectangular frame was actually rectangular, rather than the parallelogram that a casual eye would accept as close enough. Close enough was not the standard she worked to. The raised beds needed to sit level on whatever surface supported them, and level required square. She carried the frame to the swamp's eastern edge, into the area where the standing water was shallowest 4 to 6 inches, just enough to establish the isolation she needed. She set the frame into the water and drove stakes at each corner into the swamp bottom to hold it against the slow current. Then she began filling it. The swamp muck was unlike any soil she had worked with before. It was black, truly black, the color of something that had been reducing itself to its essential components for centuries, and it was heavy with the density of material that held water in itself rather than allowing it to pass through. She loaded it into the frame with a flat-bladed shovel, working from the edge of the frame out into the swamp, scooping from the bottom where the oldest and richest accumulation lay. The muck smelled of deep earth and slow water, and the mineral sharpness of organic matter, completing its conversion from leaf to soil. She mixed in clay from the ridge slope as she went 1 part clay to 3 parts muck, enough to provide structure and drainage without reducing the fertility of the mixture. The book had specified this ratio, and she followed it with the confidence of someone who has tested the principle against the evidence and found it sound. The finished bed sat 8 inches above the waterline. She wanted 18. She filled it again. The second filling brought it to 14 inches. The third brought it to 17. She packed the surface with a flat board, leveling it, pressing out the air pockets that the muck tended to hold, and when she was done, she had a planting surface 3 feet wide and 12 feet long that sat 17 inches above the standing water, surrounded on all sides by 6 inches of quiet swamp, accessible from the frame's edge or from the flat-bottomed boat she had not yet built but had already designed in her mind. She planted tomatoes in it the following morning. The seeds she had brought were from the previous fall's harvest at the Aldrin house, saved from the best plants with the selective attention she had been applying to seeds since her father taught her that the fruit of the finest plant saved and planted produced finer plants in turn. She did not know if the swamp soil would receive them the way she expected. She knew the principle. She was about to discover the practice. The practice she discovered over the following 6 weeks was remarkable. The germination was faster than anything she had seen in upland soil. Seeds she had planted in the ridge garden, taking 8 days, appeared in the swamp beds. In 5, the muck's warmth and moisture producing a germination environment so hospitable that the seeds seemed to treat the entire process as a formality they were happy to complete as quickly as possible. The early growth was vigorous in the specific way that vigorous growth was unmistakable. Thick stems, dark green leaves, the compact and purposeful architecture of a plant that was receiving exactly what it needed and was spending the surplus on structural integrity, rather than the elongated reaching of a plant straining toward inadequate light or moisture. By early June, the tomatoes were knee-high. By late June, they were setting fruit. By mid-July, the fruit was the size of her fist. She stood at the edge of the swamp on a morning in late July and looked at the first ripe tomato on the first raised bed she had ever built. And the tomato was the deep red of something that had been taking the minerals of the bottomland soil into itself for 3 months and had arrived at a density and a color that upland tomatoes grown in the thinner and more exhausted ground of conventional farms did not produce. She picked it. She bit into it, standing in the swamp in her bare feet in the shallow water, with the herons moving in the distance and the kingfisher rattling from the cypress overhead. The flavor exceeded what she was expecting because she was expecting the ordinary version of it. This was not the ordinary version of a tomato. It was the version that the bottomland soil produced when you gave it a planting surface and kept the roots above the waterline and let the capillary action do the work of irrigation for you. She ate the whole tomato standing there. She went back to the ridge and wrote down what she had observed. She had been keeping records since the first week, a notebook she had purchased in Colombia, filled with careful handwriting precise about dates and dimensions and observations, the kind of record keeping that made it possible to look back at a previous season and understand not just what had happened, but why. She noted the germination dates for each variety in each bed. She noted the soil temperature on the day she measured it by feel, which was the only thermometer she had. She noted the growth rates and the fruit sizes and the specific differences between the beds that were positioned in full sun and the ones that had more shade from the cypress, and what the differences in production told her about where to position the next beds. The next beds were already under construction. By the end of August, she had 12 raised beds. By the end of September, she had 20. Each one built with the same method as the first, each one refined slightly from the lessons of the previous one, the optimal depth of the frame, the best mixture ratio of muck to clay, the correct spacing between plants to allow the air circulation that reduced the fungal problems that wet environments sometimes produced. The cane weir she built in July when the learning of the beds had given her confidence in the principle and she was ready to apply it to the water itself. She had waded the swamp in the early morning since spring, learning its bottom topography through the body, through the particular information that feet on an uneven surface provided through the slow education of the water around her shins and knees as she moved through it. She knew where the channels were, the slightly deeper paths between the cypress stands, where the slow current from the creek still moved, where the fish followed the current the way they always followed the current, using the movement of water as a road. She built the weirs at the entrances to two channels. The V-shape was the essential mechanism, two arms of woven cane extending from the channel banks at an angle converging toward a narrow opening that led into a holding enclosure of cane and stake. Fish entering the channel found the weir arms directing them toward the opening, followed the path of least resistance the way fish did, and entered the enclosure from which they could not find the exit because the exit was a small gap at the narrowest point of the V that was easy to enter from outside and nearly impossible to find from inside. The first morning she checked the weir, she found 11 catfish in the eastern enclosure and 7 bluegill in the western one. She stood in the swamp in the early light with the water around her ankles and 18 fish in the holding area she had built the previous afternoon, and she felt the satisfaction of a system working the way a system was supposed to work. Not the satisfaction of luck, the satisfaction of applied understanding. The weir worked because fish behaved according to their nature and she had understood their nature correctly, and the understanding had produced the result. The crawfish cages went in the following week. She had built them from the scrap wire fencing she had salvaged, from the collapsed fence line at the northern edge of the property, cutting and bending the wire into cylinders 18 inches long and 8 inches in diameter, each one fitted with a funnel entrance that directed crawfish in and prevented them from finding the way back out. She baited them with fish scraps and set them in the shallower water along the swamp edges where the crawfish burrowed. 12 cages, checked every other morning, averaging 40 to 60 crawfish per cage per check. She sold the first produce at the Columbia market in September of 1884, 6 months after she had arrived at Cane Creek with a cook stove and $3.50. She loaded the cart with a flat of tomatoes, a basket of crawfish packed in wet moss, and a quantity of smoked catfish she had prepared on the outdoor rack she had built behind the cabin, a simple structure of green hickory poles over a slow fire of hickory and applewood chips, the smoke carrying a flavor into the flesh of the fish that she had been refining for weeks, adjusting the wood ratio and the distance between the fish and the fire until the result was what she wanted. She drove to Columbia in the early morning and set up at the end of a row. The man in the stall next to hers was a farmer named Tatum, who grew vegetables on an upland farm north of town and had been selling at this market for 11 years. He looked at her tomatoes and then at her, and then at the tomatoes again. "Those are some tomatoes," he said. "What kind of ground do you grow on?" She told him. He did not believe her. She said nothing more about it. She set out her display and waited for customers. The first rejection came from the man who ran the largest general store on the square. His name was Galt. He was a compact man in his 50s with the efficiency of movement that merchants develop over decades of managing inventory and customers simultaneously never still, always assessing, always calculating the gap between what he had and what people wanted and what he could make from the difference. He stopped at her stall and looked at the tomatoes. Good size, he said. Where are you from, Cane Creek, she said. South Bottomland. His expression shifted the small amount that indicated a recalculation was occurring. Bottomland produce. Swamp produce. The phrase arranged itself in the air between them without being spoken, carrying the weight of a local understanding that swamp produce was the food of people who had nothing better, that it was poor food by definition, because it came from poor ground, that selling it in the Columbia market was an act that required either innocence or a very thick skin. Galt picked up a tomato. He turned it in his hand. He set it down. Good size, he said again, but in a tone that indicated size was the only thing he was prepared to concede. He moved on. A woman stopped at the stall 20 minutes later. She was perhaps 40, practical in her dress, with the assessing eyes of a person who shopped with purpose. She looked at the tomatoes. How much, she asked. Mira told her. The woman picked up a tomato. She was not performing consideration the way Galt had performed consideration. She was actually considering turning the tomato, feeling its weight, pressing her thumb gently into the skin at the stem end to test the firmness. She bought 4. An hour later, she came back and bought 8 more. A man buying her crawfish stopped and asked where the tomatoes came from. A woman asked about the smoked fish. By 2 in the afternoon, the flat of tomatoes was gone. The crawfish were gone. She still had half the smoked fish. She was packing the remaining fish into the cart when Galt came back. Galt came back. He stood at the end of her stall with his hands in his coat pockets and the expression of a man who has reassessed a calculation and arrived at a different result than his first attempt. That woman who bought the tomatoes, he said. She told 6 people about them before she left the square. Mira folded the empty flat. I'll need a week's advance order next time, she said, and payment on delivery. Galt looked at her for a moment. He was not accustomed to being told the terms of a transaction he had not yet agreed to enter. But he was a merchant, and merchants recognized productive ground when they saw it, even when the ground in question was ground they had previously dismissed. I'll have the order ready Thursday, he said. She drove home. She had earned $4.60 in one morning at the Columbia market. This was more than she had spent on supplies in the preceding 3 months. This was, she understood, the first indication of what the system would produce at scale, not the full scale, not the 20 beds she was still building toward, but the early indication that the principle was correct and that the market existed and that the question of what was possible here was a question that could be answered by doing more of what she was already doing. In the spring of 1885, she acquired the Muscovy ducks. A farmer upstream, a man named Blevins, who kept a small operation on the higher ground 2 miles north of the creek, had more ducks than he needed and was willing to part with 12 for a price that seemed reasonable to Mira because she had calculated what 12 ducks would produce for her and found that it exceeded the price by a significant margin over the first year alone. The ducks went into the swamp and behaved as though they had been waiting their entire lives for exactly this environment, which in a functional sense they had. Muscovy ducks were swamp animals adapted by centuries of living in exactly the kind of flooded bottomland that Mira's 12 acres provided, and the swamp gave them everything they needed: the shallow water to wade in the duckweed and water plants to eat the aquatic insects and their larvae, to hunt through the shallow mud, the higher ground of the ridge to nest on when nesting was what they required. They ate the mosquito larvae from the water surface with the systematic efficiency of biological control, reducing the mosquito population on the property to a fraction of what it had been in the first season. They ate the duckweed not fast enough to remove it, but fast enough to keep it from becoming too thick in the areas where she wanted the water surface clear for the fish. They laid eggs at a rate that provided her with a steady surplus beyond what she needed for her own consumption, and the surplus went to the Columbia market in a basket beside the tomatoes, and the smoked fish, and the crawfish, and people bought them. The ducks, she wrote in her notebook in the spring of 1885, eat what the swamp provides without consuming what the swamp cannot replenish. They have joined the system rather than demanding that the system accommodate them. She was thinking about this as a farming principle. She was also thinking about it as a principle of a different kind, one that applied to more than ducks. The man who arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June of 1885 was not a duck. He came up the ridge road in a wagon alone, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had taken the measure of a situation in advance and was not concerned about how it would resolve. He was perhaps 45 broad through the jaw, wearing the clothes of a working farmer, in the condition of a man who considered his working clothes a statement about his own solidity. The wagon was good, the horses were good. Everything about him communicated the prosperity of a man who had land and knew its value and spent time thinking about other land and its value. He stopped the wagon at the base of the ridge. Mira was in the swamp checking the cane weirs, standing in the shallow water in her work dress, with her sleeves rolled up and a basket of catfish at her feet. She watched him get down from the wagon and look at the property in the assessing way of a man who had come to look at it. She climbed out of the water and walked to where he stood. Cass Witt, he said. She had not heard it spoken aloud before, but she recognized it immediately. She had read the name in the deed index the previous spring had noted. It had filed it in the category of information that was not yet relevant, but would likely become relevant. Witt Leland, water rights claim. Cane Creek upstream irrigation. Leland was dead, she knew from conversation at the market. This would be the son. He looked at the swamp. He looked at the raised beds with their tall tomato plants standing in the shallow water. He looked at the dock she had built and the flat-bottom boat tied to it. He looked at the smokehouse behind the cabin and the drying rack and the orderly row of crayfish cages visible at the north end of the property. He looked at it the way a man looked at something he wanted. "What are you asking for the ground?" he said. "I'm not selling," Mira said. He turned his head toward her slightly. He had the manner of a man who was not accustomed to the word no being offered as a complete sentence without qualification or apology. "It's swamp ground," he said. "Bottom soil. You can't plant a row crop on it. What you've done here is clever work, but it's not real farming." "Real farming," she said, noting the phrase without inflection, the way you noted the weight of a word when someone used it to mean something other than its dictionary meaning. "A woman alone in the bottomland doesn't have the capacity to develop this property to its potential," he said. "I could offer you a fair price, help you get established somewhere more suitable." She looked at him. The somewhere more suitable was the tell. He was not interested in her welfare or her potential or her establishment anywhere. He was interested in the bottomland soil and the black muck that had been building under the Cane Creek swamp for 10,000 years. The soil that she had discovered would grow tomatoes the size of a fist and sweet potatoes the size of a man's forearm. He had seen what she was growing. He was a farmer. He understood what soil that produced that yield was worth, and he understood that it was considerably more than any offer he intended to make. "Thank you for stopping," she said. She turned and walked back toward the swamp. He stood by his wagon for a moment. She was aware of him standing there the way she was aware of most things. She was not looking at the peripheral attention that she maintained as a matter of habit. Then she heard the wagon creak as he climbed back onto the seat and the sound of the horses moving on the ridge road, and he was gone. She noted the visit in her book that evening. The date, the name, the offer she had not been given because she had not waited to receive it, and the observation that Cass Witt had looked at her property the way a man looked at something he intended to have. She also noted he mentioned the prior water rights to the creek. He did not pursue it. He may pursue it. 14 months later, he pursued it. The filing arrived at her door in October of 1886, delivered by a man from the county sheriff's office, who handed her the papers with the expression of a man who delivered papers he had not written and held no particular opinion about. The papers were a legal complaint filed in Maury County Circuit Court by Cass Witt, claiming that Mira Aldrin's use of the standing water on her 12 acres constituted a violation of the prior water rights claim, recorded in the county deed index that her fish traps and crawfish cages represented unauthorized commercial exploitation of water resources subject to the Witt claim, and that the relief sought was either the cessation of her commercial activities on the property or a payment of damages and ongoing royalties to be determined by the court. She read the complaint at the kitchen table with the same methodical attention she gave every document. The argument was creative. It was not, in her assessment, legally sound. The Witt claim was for upstream irrigation rights. It was not for the standing water in the bottomland below the creek's natural spread. The water in her swamp was not creek water that she had diverted or taken from a channel. It was water that had arrived on her land by the action of gravity and the natural tendency of flooded ground to hold water, and it had been doing so for longer than the Witt family had owned anything in this county. But she was not a lawyer. She was a woman who had been reading legal documents for 2 years because she had understood from the beginning that the document she had been given was not as simple as it had been presented, and that the difference between owning something and continuing to own it was often a question of what you knew about the document that said you owned it. She went to the Columbia courthouse again. This time she spent 4 hours. She read the original Whitwater rights claim in full, not just the summary in the deed index, but the actual recorded document in the court record book. She read the case law regarding water rights claims in Tennessee as she could find it in the courthouse library, 2 volumes of annotated Tennessee statutes, and 3 years of bound circuit court opinions that she worked through systematically, reading slowly enough to understand rather than quickly enough to cover ground. She found 3 opinions from Tennessee courts in the preceding decade that addressed exactly the question she needed answered, whether an upstream irrigation rights claim extended to standing water in the natural floodplain below the claim's specified location. In all 3 cases, the court had held that it did not. Standing water in a natural floodplain was not water subject to upstream irrigation claims. The floodplain received water by the natural action of the landscape, not by the diversion or use of the upstream rights holder. The 2 things were legally and practically distinct. She wrote down the case citations. She wrote down the specific language from each opinion that was applicable to her situation. She read each passage 3 times and copied the relevant portions verbatim into her notebook. She went home. She spent 3 evenings writing her response to the court. She did not use the language of a lawyer because she was not a lawyer, and the pretense would have been immediately visible to anyone who read the document. She used the language of a woman who had read the applicable law and understood it and was presenting her understanding to the court as clearly and precisely as she was capable of doing. She attached the case citations. She attached a brief description of the hydrology of the Cane Creek bottomland, how the water arrived on her property by what mechanism, and how that mechanism differed fundamentally from a diversion of water subject to upstream rights claims. She described the Witt claim as recorded, quoted its specific language, and showed how the language of the claim did not and could not extend to the standing water in the floodplain below. The hearing was in December of 1886. The circuit court judge was a man named Hayden, who had been on the bench for 19 years and had the quality of a man who had heard a great many arguments in that time and had developed the ability to identify almost immediately whether an argument was substantive or decorative. He read both filings in advance of the hearing. At the hearing, Witt's attorney spoke for 20 minutes. Mira spoke for 12. She did not speak with rhetorical flourish. She stated what the document said and what the case law held and what the physical facts of the property were. She stated these things in the order that made them most clear, building from the specific language of the Witt claim through the applicable precedents to the conclusion that the claim did not extend to her swamp. Judge Hayden asked 2 questions. She answered both directly. He dismissed the complaint. The Witt water rights claim, he ruled, applied to the upstream creek channel and the irrigation diversion specifically described in the original filing. It did not extend to the standing water in the natural floodplain on the Aldrin property downstream. The commercial activities on the Aldrin property, the fish traps, the crawfish cages, the agricultural use of the bottomland were not subject to any restriction arising from the Witt claim. Mira walked out of the courthouse into the December cold. She drove home to Cane Creek. She wrote in her notebook that evening, Witt versus Aldrin, Maury County Circuit Court, December 1886. Dismissed. The water is mine. The land is mine. These are now matters of record. Then she wrote, he will not stop. She wrote this not from pessimism, but from the same quality of patient observation that had told her other things about other people. The reading of a man whose method for acquiring what he wanted was not abandoned because a single attempt had failed. Cass Witt was a man of a type she recognized, the type that recalibrated rather than retreated, the type that looked at an obstacle and began immediately looking for the approach from the other direction. She was right, and she did not have to wait long to find out how. The letter arrived in February of 1887. It was from a dry goods merchant in Columbia named Kastner, with whom she had an account. A modest account established in her first weeks at Cane Creek when she had needed provisions on credit and had paid the credit down over the following months and then used it again for the acquisition of the Muscovy ducks and a supply of wire for the crawfish cages and a length of canvas for a weather cover over the raised beds during the spring frosts. The balance on the account at the time she received the letter was as she had calculated it, $3.80. The letter informed her that her account had been purchased by a third party and that the full balance was due within 10 days. The third party was not named in the letter. She went to see Kastner. He was uncomfortable, which told her before he spoke what he was going to say. Men were comfortable, she had observed, when they were doing things they had decided were reasonable. They were uncomfortable when they were doing things they had been persuaded to do by the logic of money, which was a logic that could be followed step by step to its destination, and then recognized as wrong only when you arrived there and found the person you had harmed looking at you from the other side. Kastner told her the account had been acquired by Cass Witt. Mira looked at him for a moment. How much, she said. $3.80. She did not have $3.80 liquid. She had assets. The 2 years of produce and fish and crawfish had produced a steady income, but the income had gone back into the property, into the smokehouse, and the second room she had added to the cabin and the stone chimney that she had built to replace the original clay and stick one. She had $17 in coin in the tin box she kept under the floorboard of the cabin, accumulated carefully against the specific contingency of a situation she had not predicted precisely, but had known in some form was coming. She had $17 in a $3.80 debt that was now callable in 10 days. She went home. She stood on the ridge and looked at the tulip poplars. 6 of them, each over 100 feet tall, each 3 feet in diameter. She had refused to sell them 18 months ago, when a sawmill operator from town had offered her $8 each for the lot. She had kept them because a standing tree was a savings account that grew interest every year because the timber value of a tree increased with its diameter, because she was not in the business of converting assets to cash before the cash was necessary. The cash was now necessary. Not all of it, but enough of it. She went to the sawmill. The sawmill operator's name was Drummond. She had dealt with him before for smaller lumber sales from the fallen trees she had taken from the ridge in the cabin building years. He was a straightforward man, the kind who named his price without performance and did not alter it once named. She told him she wanted to sell 2 poplars. He came out to the property the following morning. He looked at the 6 trees the way he looked at all timber, with the expert eye of a man who had spent 30 years understanding the relationship between a standing tree and the boards it would yield, who could see a tree and know its board feet the way a butcher could see a calf and know its cuts. $16 for 2, he said. The ones on the north end are slightly better. She took the north too. He paid her the morning he felled them, which was 3 days later. She walked to Columbia that afternoon and found Cass Witt at his property office on the south side of the square. He was not surprised to see her. She could see this in the very slight adjustment of his expression when she came through the door, not surprise, but the minor recalibration of a man who had been expecting something and was now adjusting the timing of his expectation. She set the money on his desk. $3.80. 2 more than the debt to ensure there was no question about the final sum. She said, "The account is settled. I'll collect a receipt." Witt looked at the money. Then he looked at her. She looked back at him with the patient, careful eyes that Harlan Aldrin had not been able to stand, and she held the look the way she held most things that required holding, not aggressively, not defiantly, but simply with the steadiness of someone who had no intention of looking away first. He wrote the receipt. She took it. She walked home to Cane Creek. That evening, she sat on the porch and watched the sunset over the swamp, the light going from gold to orange to the deep rose that the swamp doubled in the water, the reflection so precise that the tree line was the only thing separating the real sky from its image. She had 4 tulip poplars remaining on the ridge, 4 trees each growing larger by the year, each one worth more today than it had been worth yesterday, and more tomorrow than it was worth today. She had paid a debt that should not have been called. She had paid it from assets that she had been conserving for reasons she had understood better than the man who tried to use the debt against her. In her notebook, she wrote February 1887. Witt acquired Kastner account and called it. Paid in full, receipt obtained. Sold 2 north poplars to Drummond for $16. 4 poplars remain on ridge. Will not carry credit accounts with any merchant connected to Witt. Will operate on cash only going forward. She also wrote, He has now tried the courts and tried the debt. He will think of something else. What he thought of next was to watch. He did not come to the property again. He did not file another lawsuit. He did not acquire any more of her accounts because she no longer carried accounts that could be acquired. He simply watched from the distance that the local geography provided, which was not so great a distance that a man attentive to the market activity in Colombia could miss the weekly evidence of what the Cane Creek bottomland was producing. And the production continued. The third and fourth years, 1887 and 1888, were the years in which the property became what it had been capable of becoming from the beginning, when the soil and the water and the accumulated work of the preceding seasons combined to produce at the rate that a well-understood system produces when all of its components are in their proper relationship with each other. The smokehouse went up in the late summer of 1887, a proper structure of stone and split oak on a clay, mortared foundation with a vented top and a firebox design that she had refined from the outdoor rack she had been using for 3 years, a design that allowed her to control the smoke density and the heat level precisely enough to produce a consistent product that people at the Columbia market had begun to rely on. The second room was added to the cabin in October of 1887, extending the south wall and providing a proper storage room for the preserved foods, the canned tomatoes and beans and squash she put up each fall, the smoked fish, the dried sweet potatoes stored in the root cellar she had dug into the ridge the previous spring, the pickled vegetables and the preserved fruit from the small orchard of apple and persimmon she had planted at the southern end of the ridge. The stone chimney replaced the original clay and stick construction in November of 1887. She had been planning the replacement since the second winter, gathering fieldstone from the ridge and the creek bank over 2 years, building the stone supply. While she built the knowledge of stone laying, she needed asking Tatum at the market about mortar mix and watching the construction of a new church foundation in Columbia to understand how the courses were set. The chimney took her 3 weeks to build. It drew better than the original from the first fire she made in it. She stood beside it in the December cold and held her hand above the opening and felt the pull of the draw that she had designed, the slight but constant current of air that a well-made chimney produced, and she felt the satisfaction of a thing done in its final form rather than its provisional one. The dock was built from tulip poplar planks cut at the sawmill from a tree she had felled that fall, not one of the remaining 4, but a younger tree from the ridge that had grown large enough to yield useful lumber and small enough that its removal would not significantly affect the ridge canopy. The dock ran 8 feet out from the ridge edge into the shallows, wide enough to work from, fitted with a cleat for the boat, and a low rail that served as a drying rack for the crawfish cages when she pulled them for cleaning. The boat she built herself from the remaining planks, a flat-bottom design 12 feet long and 3 feet wide, heavy enough to be stable and light enough that she could manage it alone with a push-pole in the shallow water, which was how she moved through most of the property. Standing in the stern, pushing against the swamp bottom, moving between the raised beds and the fish traps and the crawfish cages in the early mornings, when the light was still low and the herons were working the same water from the other end. By the fall of 1888, she was operating 23 raised beds, 11 fish weirs, 16 crawfish cages, and the smokehouse at its full production capacity, selling at the Columbia market every week, and taking orders for the following week on everything she could produce faster than she could bring it in. The income from the 4 sources produced smoked fish, live crawfish, and duck eggs combined to exceed what she knew from market conversation that Harlan Aldrin's 240 acres of upland farm produced in an average year. 12 acres of swamp and 4 acres of ridge, against 240 acres of pasture and crop ground. She did not make this comparison aloud. She did not make it in her notebook. She made it privately in the accounting that she kept in her head, the running calculation of what was happening on this ground versus what the conventional wisdom about this ground had predicted would happen. The calculation confirmed the thing she had understood from the ridge line on her first morning, that the value of a piece of ground was not a fixed property of the ground itself, but a function of what the person working it was willing to see. Harlan Aldrin had looked at the bottomland and seen swamp. She had looked at the same ground and seen a system. And Cass Witt, watching from his upstream property with the patient attention of a man who had not given up on something he wanted, was watching the difference between those two ways of seeing express itself in the weekly evidence of the Columbia market, in the orders that people placed for produce from the Cane Creek bottomland in the growing reputation of a woman who had turned 12 acres of standing water into the most productive small farm in Maury County. She knew he was watching. She noted it in her book without anxiety, the way she noted the weather as a fact of the environment, something to be accounted for in planning, rather than a source of distress. She planted the beds for the following spring. She checked the fish traps. She baited the crawfish cages. The swamp did what the swamp had always done, which was to work without being asked, feeding everything that came close enough to receive what it had to offer, giving without diminishing, producing without pause, running the same system it had been running since before there was anyone to notice. Mira noticed. She had always been the kind of person who noticed. The summer was coming, the summer and whatever it would bring. The drought of 1889 did not arrive all at once. This was what people remembered afterward when they tried to explain it to those who had not been there, that the worst part was not the day it arrived, but the way it came in increments. Each increment small enough to explain away each one accumulating on the previous until the accumulation was no longer explainable and no longer deniable, and the only thing left was the reckoning. The first week of June, the shallow wells went dry. The wells that had been dug too fast in the boom years of the previous decade, the wells sunk into the upper water table by men who were in a hurry to finish them and assumed the water table would always be where they found it. These were the first to go, and when they went, the farmers who owned them looked at their neighbors' wells and told themselves it was a local problem, a specific failure of a specific depth, the kind of thing that happened and would correct itself when the rain came. The rain did not come. The second week of June was drawn. The third week of June was drawn. By the 1st of July, the air had acquired the quality of air in a kiln, not the comfortable warmth of early summer, but a dryness that pulled the moisture from everything it touched, from the soil and the crops and the wood of the fence posts and the skin of the people working in it. The corn on the upland farms, which had been knee-high in late May, with the reliable vigor of a crop in its first weeks, stopped growing. The stalks went pale at the tip first, then pale along the edges of the leaves, the paleness spreading inward toward the midrib as the plant redirected its diminishing water supply toward survival rather than growth. By the second week of July, the corn on Harlan Aldrin's farm was not growing. It was not yet dying. It occupied the middle ground between those two conditions that farmers called standing, which meant it was still upright and technically alive, but had suspended the activity of living in order to wait for conditions that would permit living to resume. The tobacco, which was the cash crop, was more sensitive than the corn. Tobacco needed water at specific moments in its growth, the setting of the leaves, the broadening of the blade, the curing process that determined the quality of the harvest, and therefore the price at market. Without adequate water during any of these moments, the yield dropped. Without adequate water during all of them, the yield was not a yield. It was a loss. Harlan walked his tobacco rows on a morning in mid-July and looked at the plants and did the arithmetic that the plants compelled him to do. He had borrowed against the expected crop in the spring, as he did most years, the standard practice of a farmer whose expenses preceded his income by 6 months, and who managed the gap with the credit that a man of his standing could obtain from the county bank. The amount borrowed was predicated on an expected yield. The expected yield required rain that had not come. The arithmetic walked to its conclusion, arrived at a number he did not like. He walked the rows twice. The number did not change. 20 miles south on the ridge above the Cane Creek bottomland, Mira was checking the water level. She had been monitoring it since the last rain in late May, measuring the depth at 3 fixed points she had established in the first year, a stake driven into the swamp bottom at the northern end, a stake at the center near the largest cypress stand, a stake at the southern outlet where the water left the property. She measured with a marked pole each morning, noting the measurement in her book alongside the date and the temperature and the sky condition. The swamp was losing water. She had known it would lose water, standing water in a dry summer lost to evaporation at a rate she had learned to calculate from 2 years of observation, and this summer was drier than anything she had seen since she arrived at Cane Creek. But the rate of loss was slower than she had calculated for a drought of this severity, because the swamp was not losing water only to evaporation. It was being replenished. Cane Creek was lower than she had ever seen it, but it was still flowing. The creek flowed because its headwaters were in the higher ground 20 miles to the north, where the terrain captured rain from the seasonal patterns that moved across the Cumberland Plateau, and the creek's flow was sustained by the groundwater seeping from the surrounding hills into the channel, even when the surface precipitation stopped. The flow was reduced, but it was not zero. And because the flow was not zero, the swamp continued to receive its slow input of water, even as it was losing water to the sky. The raised beds built 18 inches above the waterline were 3 inches above the current waterline. She noted this in her book. 3 inches of margin remaining. She needed to watch it. She also noted something else, something that was not a calculation, but an observation about the market, about what the drought meant for what she was producing and what everyone around her was not. The Columbia market in July was thinner than she had ever seen it. Stalls that were normally full of produce were displaying reduced quantities or nothing at all. Tatum, the farmer from the north, who had been her neighbor at the market for 2 years, showed up on a Thursday with a cart that was half empty and a face that was the face of a man performing composure over something that was not composed. "How is it up north?" she asked him. He looked at his half-empty cart and said, "We've had worse." This was the specific lie of a man who was managing his situation by managing its description, and she did not press it. She noted what the empty cart said without needing him to say it. She sold everything she brought that morning. She sold it faster than she could bag it with a line of buyers that she had not seen since the previous fall, when the apple harvest had brought people out to the market in unusual numbers. She ran out of tomatoes by 9 in the morning. She ran out of smoked fish by 10. She still had crawfish and duck eggs in preserved goods when noon came and she began packing up, and these she sold at a pace that told her the town had begun to understand, with the slow and reluctant understanding of a place that does not want to believe, something that the drought was not going to break before the summer was over. She drove home and increased the production capacity of the smokehouse. The week of July 21st, the creek at Galt's Mill north of Columbia dropped below the wheel, and the mill stopped grinding. This was an event of a different category than dry wells and failing crops. The mill was the center of the county's food processing infrastructure, the mechanism by which wheat and corn became flour and meal, and when the mill stopped, the county's pantry stopped being replenished. People who had been telling themselves the drought was temporary began to do the arithmetic they had been avoiding. On the morning of the 28th of July, Mira was in the swamp checking the eastern weir when she heard the sound of a wagon on the ridge road. She straightened up in the water and looked toward the sound. The wagon was Cass Witt's. She knew it before she could see the driver knew it from the sounds of the horses and the rattle of that wagon's ironwork sounds she had cataloged without meaning to over the years of occasional sightings when he had driven the Cane Creek Road and she had been visible from the road and he had looked at her property with the patient, covetous attention of a man keeping an inventory of something he intended to eventually acquire. She waded to the dock and tied off the boat and climbed up to the ridge. He stopped the wagon at the base of the ridge. He did not come up. He sat on the seat and looked at her as she came down the ridge path toward him, and she watched his face do the work of assembling an expression for the situation. The expression he assembled was not comfortable. It was the expression of a man arriving at a place he had decided to arrive at and finding that arriving was harder than the decision had been. Witt was not a small man, but he looked smaller on the wagon seat than she had ever seen him look. Not physically smaller, smaller in the sense of reduced the way a thing is reduced when the context it usually occupies has changed and the context is now someone else's, and the thing must occupy it on different terms. He had cattle, he said. They needed water. His own source had been low since June and was now at a level that was not sufficient for the herd. He was not asking for charity. He was asking whether he could bring the cattle to Cane Creek to drink. On her property, along the section of the creek bank at the northern end of her land where the bank was accessible and the water was still running. He did not say please. He did not frame it as a request precisely, but as an inquiry about a practical arrangement that would benefit his cattle and presumably her sense of community obligation. He had the manner of a man who had constructed the approach as carefully as possible and was aware that even the most careful construction was not going to make this comfortable. She looked at him. She thought about the courthouse in the December of 1886, the circuit court judge reading both filings, the 20 minutes of Witt's attorney and the 12 minutes of her own argument and the ruling that had come at the end of it. She thought about the letter from Kastner in February of 1887, the $3.80 called in 10 days, The two tulip poplars felled and sold to pay a debt that had been weaponized rather than called for any legitimate purpose. She thought about the four tulip poplars that were still standing on the ridge above the swamp, growing larger by the year. She thought about the cattle, which were animals, which had nothing to do with any of it, and which needed water, the way all animals needed water, which was without reference to the complications of the people responsible for them. The creek had room, she said. Morning was best before 8, when the water was clearest and the bank was not yet soft from the afternoon heat. Whit looked at her for a moment. He nodded once. He turned the wagon around and drove back up the ridge road. She went back to the swamp. She wrote in her notebook that evening in the entry for July 28th, Whit came for water access for his cattle. I said yes. He did not mention the lawsuit or the debt. I did not mention them. The cattle need water. That is the whole of it. She read this over once and then added a second line. This is easier than it would have been a year ago. I am not sure what that means about me, or about time, or about the distance between holding a thing and being held by it. 4 days later, on the 1st of August, she saw the Aldrin wagon on the ridge road. She was on the porch when they came, sitting with her morning coffee in the early light before the day's heat set in, watching the mist that the swamp produced in the cool of the early morning, the slow curling of water vapor from the surface in the way that warm water produced vapor when the air above it was cooler than the water itself. The swamp was still warmer than the air in the early mornings, even in this drought, because water held its temperature through the night in the way that soil did not. The thermal mass of 8 acres of standing water, releasing the previous day's heat gradually through the dark hours. She saw the wagon at the top of the ridge road and recognized it before she could see the occupants. Harlan's wagon had a specific cant to the left, from a wheel repair done incorrectly in the previous decade, a cant he had never corrected because the correction would have required admitting the first repair was wrong. She had noticed it in the first year of her marriage, and she noticed it now, the familiar lean of a familiar vehicle on an unfamiliar road. She set down her coffee and watched them come. Harlan was driving. Ida sat beside him in the way she always sat in wagons, with the rigid posture of a woman who did not fully trust the vehicle or the road, or possibly anything below the level of the seat. She was wearing her church bonnet, which Mira noted as a detail that told her something. Ida Pia wore the church bonnet for situations she had decided in advance required a particular presentation. Coming to ask something from the woman you had expelled from your household probably qualified. They stopped at the base of the ridge. Harlan got down from the wagon with the deliberate movement of a man whose joints were making their age, known the small grimace as he put weight on the right knee that had been stiff since a fall in the barn in 1878. He had not been to the Cane Creek bottomland since the morning in March of 1884, when he had driven south with the deed, established his generosity with a signed document, and driven home satisfied. He looked at the property now, with the attention of a man who had expected one thing and was processing another. The cabin was there. The smokehouse was there. The dock was there with the flat-bottomed boat tied at the cleat. The raised beds extended into the swamp in their orderly rows, the tomato plants heavy with fruit, the squash vines covering the surface of several beds in a green abundance that was visible from the ridge. The ducks moved through the shallows between the beds, with their characteristic unhurried efficiency, eating whatever needed eating, producing as they went. In the distance, the swamp held its water in the green stillness of a thing that had been managing this drought with the resources it had been building for 10,000 years. A thing that did not require the rain that had failed everything else because it had its own arrangements with the water that came. Harlan looked at it. She watched his face from the porch. She watched the sequence of expressions that passed across it, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow thoroughness of a man doing actual revision rather than surface adjustment. He had given this away. He had looked at 12 acres of bottomland and seen worthlessness, and the worthlessness had served his purposes. The removal of the inconvenient daughter-in-law had required a destination, and the swamp had provided one, and the transaction had been completed and filed in the category of generous decisions appropriately made. And now he was looking at what the worthless ground had become. He was 58 years old. He had farmed for 35 years. He understood soil and production and the relationship between what the land could do and what the people working it understood and about what it could do. He understood these things at the level of someone who had lived by them, and the understanding was turning in him now like a key in a lock. She went down from the porch to meet them. She did not hurry. She walked at the pace the ridge path required, which was careful in the dry weather, when the clay surface was loose, and she arrived at the wagon with the unhurried bearing of a person whose ground this was and who was receiving visitors on it. Harlan said they needed water. He said it simply without preamble, which she took as a kind of credit to him. He had not constructed an approach, had not dressed the request in the language of social niceties that would have required her to process the niceties before arriving at the actual meaning. He said they needed water, and they had understood she might be able to help, and he was here to ask. Ida had not come down from the wagon. She sat on the seat with her church bonnet and her rigid posture, and her eyes that were looking at the swamp and not at Mira. Mira showed Harlan where to fill the water barrels, the spot at the creek bank where the water was cleanest and the access was easiest. She showed him the path down the ridge. She went back to the cabin and she put together a basket. The basket held smoked catfish, 6 tomatoes, a dozen duck eggs, and a portion of pickled beans from the cellar. She carried it to the wagon and set it on the seat beside Ida. Ida looked at the basket. Then she looked at Mira for a fraction of a second longer than the look required, with the quality of a woman who has arrived at a moment she did not know how to prepare for because she had not known this moment was possible, and is receiving it with whatever tools she has available, which are not the tools this moment requires. She said nothing. Mira said nothing. Harlan came back up the ridge with the first barrel filled and loaded it into the wagon and went back down for the second. When the wagon was loaded and Harlan was back on the seat, he looked at her from the elevation of the wagon seat and said, "We'll be back next week if that's all right." "You know the way," Mira said. They drove back up the ridge road. Erzaman. She went to the cabin and sat at the kitchen table for a moment. She sat the way she sat when she needed the stillness that the table provided, the grounding of a solid surface and a straight-backed chair, the physical architecture of a place she had made. She was not triumphant. She had understood for most of her life that triumph was a feeling produced by a contest, and she had not been contesting. She had been farming. The drought had not been her strategy, and the Aldrin's arrival had not been her objective. She had been doing the work that the swamp required season after season, and the drought had found her prepared and found everything around her unprepared, and the difference between those two conditions had produced the current morning. She thought, simply satisfied in the deep and quiet way of someone who had worked correctly for a long time and found that working correctly had been sufficient. They came back the following week. They came back the week after that. By the third visit, Ida was getting down from the wagon. She came down with the same careful deliberateness that Harlan showed the acknowledgement in the body of years that were accumulating, and she stood at the base of the ridge and looked at the swamp and the raised beds with an attention that was different from the attention she had brought to the first visit. The first visit had been the attention of someone absorbing a shock. This was the attention of someone who had absorbed the shock and was now beginning to look at the thing itself rather than at the gap between what they expected and what they found. She asked no questions on the third visit. She looked and she was quiet, and she went back to the wagon when Harlan had the barrels filled. On the fourth visit, she walked to the edge of the swamp. Mira was there pulling weeds from the gap between two raised beds, the flat-bottomed boat tied to the nearest bed's frame as a work platform. She heard Ida's footsteps on the dock, and she straightened up in the boat, and she looked at the older woman standing on the dock's edge, looking at the beds. "Those are raised," Ida said. "Not on the ground." "On frames," Mira said. "The roots can't sit in standing water. The frame holds the soil above the waterline." Ida looked at the nearest bed, at the dark surface of the soil, 18 inches above the water, at the tomato plants rising from it, with the vigor that the swamp soil produced. She looked at the water around the frame. She looked at the path the boat had taken between the beds. "You built all of these," she said. "All of them," Mira said. Ida stood on the dock for another moment. Then she turned and walked back to the wagon. On the fifth visit, she asked how the frames were made. Mira told her. The split log, the corner joints, the nails, and the stakes. The mixture of muck and clay. The depth required. The spacing between plants to allow air circulation. She gave the information the way she gave all information, directly, without embellishment, in the order that was most useful to someone who was receiving it to put it to use. Ida listened in the way she did everything precisely without indicating what she thought of what she was hearing. Then she said, "How do you get the muck up into the frame without losing half of it in the water?" "A flat-bladed shovel," Mira said. and you work from inside the frame rather than reaching over the side. Ida nodded once. She went back to the wagon. The summer moved through its difficult weeks. The creek fell further, though it did not fail. The upland farms around the county were doing what they could, which in most cases was not enough harvesting, what the drought had left them, which was in some cases nothing. In most cases not enough, in a few cases, the minimum sufficient to continue. The county had the haunted, thin quality of a place that has been tested and has not entirely passed the test. The quality of stripped larders and borrowed time, and the silence that settles over a community when enough people are worried about the same thing simultaneously. At the Columbia Market, Mira's stall was the center of the activity that was left. The orders she took at the end of each Thursday ran longer than the previous week, the surplus she had been building in the smokehouse drawing down faster than she could replenish it. She increased the smoking operation, running the smokehouse 2 shifts instead of 1, the fires going from before dawn to after dark. Hickory smoke rising from the chimney in the thin thread that meant the fire was controlled and the temperature was correct. She was in the dry summer of 1889, the most productive farm in the county. She noted this in her book without celebration, the way she noted everything as a fact in the record, a data point in the ongoing account of what the swamp was capable of and what the people around it were willing to see. On the 14th of August, Cass Witt came in the early afternoon with his cattle. She was on the porch when she heard them, the sound of a herd moving on a dry road, the shuffle and breath, and the occasional low sound that cattle made when they were being moved and understood they were being moved somewhere. She stood at the porch rail and watched 8 head of Hereford cattle come down the ridge road, driven by Witt and a boy who was probably his son, a quiet, careful-looking child of perhaps 12, who handled his side of the driving with a competence beyond his age. Witt directed the cattle to the creek bank at the northern end of the property without speaking to Mira. He positioned himself at one side and the boy at the other, and the cattle went to the water with the single-minded urgency of the animals that needed water and had found it. The boy looked at the swamp while the cattle drank. He looked at it the way children looked at things they were genuinely curious about, without the social management that adults brought to looking at things without the pretense of not looking, without the assessment of what looking would communicate to the person being looked at. He looked at the raised beds and the boat and the ducks moving between the cypress knees and the herons working the shallows, and his expression was the expression of someone who had not known a place like this existed and was revising his sense of what the world contained. Myra watched him from the porch. When the cattle had drunk and were settled on the bank, Witt came up the ridge toward the cabin. He came with the manner of a man doing something he had decided to do and was not going to perform reluctance, about which she found more honest than the alternatives. He stopped at the base of the porch steps. He said, "I want you to know, I understand I was wrong about the water rights." She waited. "I thought there was a case there," he said. "There wasn't. I read the ruling twice, both times after I was sure Hayden had got it wrong, and I understood by the second reading that he hadn't." She said nothing. He looked at the swamp. "I thought this was poor ground," he said. "Worthless. Good for nothing but mosquitoes." She looked at the swamp beside him for a moment. "Most people thought that," she said. He nodded once, not at her, but at the swamp, the nod of a man acknowledging a fact. He went back to his cattle and moved them off the property and up the ridge road, and he did not come again with the cattle, but he did not need to because the creek rose 3 inches in the last week of August from a storm that passed through the upper watershed, a storm that brought no rain to the county, but ran its water south through the creek system and arrived at Cane Creek as a modest but sufficient rise in the water level. The drought was not over, but it had peaked. The Aldrins continued their Thursday visits through August and into September. Harlan had stopped making any pretense of the visits being primarily about the water barrels. He filled the barrels each time because the upland wells were still low and the practical need was still real, but the visits had taken on the quality of a habit that had established itself beyond its original justification. On the second Thursday of September, Ida wore her garden clothes. This was the detail that told Mira the visit had shifted into a different category. Not the church bonnet of the first visit, not the good dress she had worn on the subsequent ones, but the practical gray dress and the work apron and the flat-soled shoes that Ida wore when she intended to do something and did not intend to worry about the condition of her clothing while she was doing it. She got down from the wagon before Harlan had the horses fully stopped. She walked to the dock without asking. She looked at the tools on the dock rail, the flat-bladed shovel, the stakes, the hammer, the bag of nails. She looked at the stack of split oak in the tool storage at the dock's edge, the lumber that Mira had been cutting in preparation for 2 new beds she planned to add before the season ended. She looked at Mira. "How do you start?" she said. The morning was clear, the September sky, the wash blue of a sky that has relinquished summer and is not yet fully committed to fall, and the swamp was quiet in the way that September mornings were quiet, the herons at their stations in the shallows, the ducks working the water plant beds along the northern edge. Mira picked up the flat-bladed shovel. She led Ida off the dock and into the shallows at the eastern edge of the swamp, the place where the water was shallowest and the bottom was firmest, and the building was easiest for someone doing it for the first time. She waded into her knees and Ida waded in beside her without hesitation. The work shoes immediately wet the gray hem of the work dress, darkening at the waterline, neither of these things appearing to trouble her. Mira set the first log of the frame. She showed Ida how to hold the other end while she positioned the corner joint, how to drive the first nail at the right angle to achieve the compression that would hold the joint against the weight of the soil. She showed her how to test the frame for square with the diagonal string before adding the fill, because a frame that was not square would produce a bed that was not level, and a bed that was not level would drain unevenly, and the drainage would compromise the beds at one end. Ida held the string while Mira measured. The string was level, the frame was square. They began to fill it. The swamp muck came up on the flat-bladed shovel with the resistance of material that held itself together through cohesion rather than friction, the resistance of something that did not want to be moved, but could be moved with the right tool and the right application of leverage. Ida took the second shovel that Mira handed to her, and she filled her shovel, and she deposited the fill into the frame, and she did it again. They worked in silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of two people who cannot find a basis for speech, but the functional silence of two people who are doing something that requires their attention and have implicitly agreed that the doing is sufficient for the moment. The swamp made its sounds around them, the water and the birds and the slow movement of the current through the cypress roots, and the morning moved on its own schedule and the frame filled. They did not speak about the deed. They did not speak about the 3 years in the Aldrin house, about the silence of Ida's disapproval across 3 years of meals, about the 2 pregnancies that had failed, and the judgment that Ida had applied to the failure, and the word that had been used in the conversation that Mira had not been supposed to hear, but had heard standing in the hallway outside the kitchen, the word that had been used to describe what Mira was, and what Mira was therefore worth, and what the appropriate resolution of Mira's presence in the household was. These things were present in the swamp with them, the way history is present in a landscape embedded in the ground beneath the water, available to be recovered if someone chose to dig for it, but not on the surface, not demanding to be engaged. Ida was here. She was in the swamp. She was learning to build a raised bed from the woman she had expelled from her household, with a deed to 12 acres of standing water, and the expectation that 12 acres of standing water was a punishment sufficient to communicate everything that needed to be communicated. The swamp had turned the punishment into something else, and now Ida was standing in the thing the swamp had become, learning it with her hands, which was the only way anything was learned that was worth knowing. By mid-morning, the frame was filled to the depth. Mira had specified the dark muck mixed with the ridge clay at the ratio she had described, the surface leveled with the flatboard, the whole structure sitting correctly above the waterline. Ida looked at it from the edge of the frame. She looked at the surface of the soil in the frame, and at the water surrounding it, and at the other beds extending away across the swamp in their rows. She did not say anything about what she saw. She looked at it with the contained, measuring attention that had always characterized her, the same attention that had been measuring Mira across 3 years of a household, the same attention that had arrived at judgments that were wrong in the way that judgments are wrong when they measure the right things by the wrong standard. They waded back to the dock. Mira washed the shovels in the swamp edge and hung them on the dock rail. Ida wrung the hem of the work dress without apparent concern for the fact of its wetness. She looked at her shoes, which were soaked. She looked at them with the practical assessment of a woman who had spent 60 years in practical relationship with the reality of wet shoes and was going to be fine. "I'll need to plant it," Ida said. She meant the bed. Mira went to the cabin and came back with a paper packet. Tomato seeds Cherokee variety saved from the best fruit of the current season. She gave them to Ida. Plant them in rows 8 inches apart, she said. The swamp does the rest. Ida took the packet. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the swamp, at the beds extending across it in their orderly rows, at the green abundance that the dry summer had not reduced because the swamp had been sustaining it through the mechanisms it had developed long before anyone arrived to make use of them. Then she looked at Mira. She looked at her with the full attention of her careful eyes, not measuring this time, not calculating, but receiving, looking at Mira, the way you looked at something you had misjudged so comprehensively that the misjudgment was going to require a long time to fully revise. She did not speak. She put the seed packet in her apron pocket and walked to the wagon. Harlan loaded the water barrels. They drove away. The season ended. The drought broke in the first week of October, the rains arriving finally with the extravagance of a thing that has been withheld too long, soaking the ground that had cracked in the summer heat, filling the wells that had gone dry in June, raising the creek back toward its normal channels. The county emerged from the drought with the inventory that droughts always produce: the accounting of what was lost, what was damaged, what would recover, and what would not. Several farms had sold equipment to cover debts incurred against crops that had failed. One family had left the county entirely. The tobacco crop, countywide, had been the worst in 20 years. The Aldrin farm had survived the drought in the way that Mira's 5 years of market observation allowed her to understand without being told directly, not comfortably, but sufficiently carrying a debt load that the spring crop would need to service and that would require a good year to put fully behind them. Which was why on the evening of a Thursday in the second week of November, Harlan Aldrin drove alone to Cane Creek and came up the ridge path to the porch and sat in the second chair that Mira kept there for visitors. The evening was cold, the first real cold of the season, the air carrying the clarity of November air that had released its humidity and become something thin and transparent that made the stars look closer and the sounds carry farther. The swamp held the night in the way it held everything, quietly, with the equanimity of a body of water that had seen a great many seasons and had developed a patience for them. Harlan sat in the chair with his hands on his knees, and he looked at the swamp. He did not look at her. This was not avoidance. It was the behavior of a man who was preparing to say something and was using the act of looking at something neutral as the preparation, the way you might look at a landscape when you are organizing words. The organization took a while. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had been good at it for as long as she could remember. The patience with silence that came from understanding that silence was not empty, but was often the medium through which the important things finally arrived. He said the farm had a poor year. She knew this. He said, "We have debt from the spring advance that the tobacco didn't cover." She knew this too, though she had not been told. He said winter is going to be lean. He said it the way he said most things, factually, without inflation. The lean winter ahead was a fact he was presenting rather than a suffering he was performing. And then he said the thing he had driven 20 miles to say. He said, "Could we stay here for the winter?" He said it quietly. He said, "Until the spring crop comes in." The question settled into the November air between them. She did not move. She looked at the swamp, at the November swamp, with its cypress going bare. The leaves having come down in the October rains, the bare branches over the water, giving the swamp a different quality in November than it had in summer. Not lesser, just different. The structure of the trees visible now without their foliage, the architecture of the cypresses in the still water, like the architecture of something designed, something built with intention across 1,000 years. Harlan Aldrin, who had set a deed on the kitchen table and called 12 acres of bottom land a gift, who had driven the same road 20 miles south in March of 1884 with the practiced confidence of a man who had arranged things to his satisfaction and was delivering his arrangement to a woman who had no standing to contest it, who was sitting in a chair on her porch in November of 1889, asking to stay through the winter. She looked at the swamp that had made him come back. There were things she could have said. The inventory of the 5 years was available to her, every item of it, the deed and the clause about water rights, and the courthouse in December, and the letter from Kastner in February, and the 2 tulip poplars felled to pay a debt called by the man who had tried to take her land. All of it available, all of it accurate. She did not say any of it, not because she had forgiven the accounting she had not, and forgiveness was a different transaction from the one that was occurring on this porch tonight. But because the thing that had been done to her had been done by people who did not know what they were doing, who had looked at 12 acres of standing water and seen worthlessness and had given the worthlessness to a woman they wanted to dispose of, not understanding that what they were giving her was not a punishment, but a provision. Not understanding that what they were telling her in the language of the deed in the third paragraph in the departure instruction was that she was free. Free to learn the swamp, free to read the water, free to build the raised beds in the standing water and set the weirs in the channels and put the crawfish cages in the shallows and smoke the fish on the hickory rack and sit on the porch every evening and watch the light do what it did over the water. Free to become in 5 years the woman who was sitting on this porch while Harlan Aldrin asked to stay through the winter. She looked at the man in the chair beside her. He was 60 years old. He would be 60 for another 3 months. He had farmed for 37 years, and he had a stiff right knee, and he had looked at her porch and her smokehouse and her swamp, and he had understood something in August that he was not going to say out loud, and she was not going to require him to say out loud because requiring him to say it would be cruelty, and cruelty was what had been practiced on her by people who considered themselves justified, and she was not interested in practicing what she had been taught. "You can stay," she said. She said it without drama, without ceremony, the way she said things that were true and did not require the addition of anything to make them more than they were. "The swamp has room." Harlan looked at the water. He did not say thank you. He did not say I was wrong. He sat in the chair and looked at the November swamp in the November dark. And he did what men like Harlan did when they arrived at a truth that was too large to be stated and too real to be avoided. He sat with it in the presence of the place that had produced it, and the sitting was all the acknowledgement that was required. The creek moved through the bottom of the swamp in its slow November current, carrying what it carried from the high ground to the south, giving what it gave to the water that spread from its channel into the bottomland, as it always had and always would. The cypress stood in the water with their bare November branches. The ducks were on the ridge for the night, settled into the nesting boxes she had built for them at the wood's edge. The beds were empty of their summer growth, mulched and covered for the winter, resting in the way that well-made things rested between the demands of their seasons. She sat in the chair with the November cold on her face and the familiar sounds of the swamp in its evening configuration, the frogs having gone down for the winter, but the creek still audible at the northern edge of the property, the small sound of moving water in a still landscape. She thought about the book in Harlan's library. The thin volume behind the county land surveys the cultivation methods, the raised beds. She thought about the afternoon she had found it and sat in the library chair reading it with the focused attention of someone who was learning something they would need, though they did not yet know when they would need it or what the needing would look like. She thought about the ridge line in March of 1884, standing above 8 acres of standing water and seeing the system rather than the swamp. She thought about all of the work between that morning and this evening. The trees felled and the logs notched, and the clay mixed, and the weirs built, and the cages baited, and the fish smoked, and the market attended, and the courthouse visited, and the judge listened to, and the 2 tulip poplars sold, and the 4 tulip poplars kept standing on the ridge above her. She thought about Ida in the September swamp standing in the water in her work shoes, without apparent concern for their wetness, holding the diagonal string, while Mira measured the frame for square. The frame had been square, the work had been good, and the man in the chair beside her had driven 20 miles to sit on a porch that existed because of the work in the evening light of a swamp that existed because of the work, and to ask a question that the work had made possible to answer. "You can stay," she had said. "The swamp has room." This was the truth of the place she had built. Not that it triumphed over what had been done to her, not that it reversed the judgment or repaid the injury, but that it had grown into something large enough to hold even the people who had given it away as an insult. The swamp did not triumph. The swamp simply continued. It received what came to it, and it gave what it had to give, and it asked nothing for the giving, except that the thing it was given be understood for what it was. Harlan stayed on the porch until the cold became something more than November cold, until the sharpness of a night dropping toward freezing made the porch less hospitable than the inside. He stood and pulled his coat together and nodded at the swamp in the dark. Not at her, at the swamp, the nod of a man accepting something from a source that had earned the right to be accepted. He went down the ridge to his wagon. She heard the wagon move on the road above, heard the horses settling into the pace of the return trip, heard the cant to the left rattle of the wheel that had been repaired wrong in the previous decade and never corrected. Then the sound was gone and the night was quiet, and the swamp was what it had always been, which was everything it needed to be. She went inside. She made her fire in the stone chimney she had built to replace the clay and stick chimney of the first winter, the chimney that drew correctly and held its heat correctly and had been built the second time and built right. She put the kettle on the good iron stove, and while the water heated, she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and the lamp, and she opened to the entry for the day, and she wrote the date in the upper right corner. She wrote, Harlan asked to stay through the winter. I said yes. She wrote, the swamp has room. She wrote nothing more about it because there was nothing more to write. The facts were the record, and the record was complete. The kettle began its small sound above the fire. Outside, the swamp moved in its November darkness, the creek giving its water to the bottomland in the way it had given it for 10,000 years. The cypress standing in the water, where they had stood for longer than that, the whole system running its ancient business beneath the cold stars, feeding what came to it, keeping its own counsel. Remembering in the way that water remembered things, which was without words and without failure and without end.